really move the needle on the challenges democracy faces today. And our speaker today is someone who has made it his life's work to understand why people believe things that aren't true and what we can do about it. Péter Krekó is a behavioral scientist and one of Europe's leading experts on disinformation, working in a context that he himself described as a post-truth laboratory. His research gets at questions that matter enormously right now. Why do people fall for disinformation? What does it do to our politics and our institutions? And crucially, how do we fight back? What makes Péter stand out is that he doesn't just publish academic work and leave it there. He turns research into real-world impact. He leads Hungary's National Disinformation Monitoring Hub, which operates under the European Commission's European Digital Media Observatory. He's also the director of the Political Capital Institute. His academic home is Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, where he is an associate professor and leads the Disinformation and Artificial Intelligence Research Lab. He has held fellowships and visiting positions at some of the world's most respected institutions, including, among others, Cambridge, Johns Hopkins, Indiana University, and the European University Institute. In short, Péter is someone who understands disinformation from the inside out and who has spent his career making sure that such understanding actually changes things. Please welcome Péter Krekó.
Thank you very much, Bram, for the kind introduction, and also thank you. Thanks for Emily as well for making it possible that I'm here. I'm really honored to be here as a participant, unfortunately only for 2 weeks here in Brussels, as associated to Brias, but this is an institution that has the interdisciplinary spirit that I tend to think that I myself have as well, or I'm at least not that disciplined enough to just stay with one discipline. And how big the idea is going to be that I'm presenting to you, you have to judge yourself. But what helps me quite a lot is that in my home country, Hungary, there are some quite interesting political things happening, which Hungary have become. Laboratory of what exactly? Maybe post-truth, maybe of democracy, hopefully. I will touch upon that, but it can help me maybe to elaborate on some ideas that real life have made significant in the last year. And the title of my presentation, the subtitle, and thanks for all of you for coming, especially because the subtitle of my presentation was the original title, and if you can imagine a less clickbait title than that, I think it just doesn't exist. So what I'm going to talk about is informational autocracies in general in the world, state-sponsored disinformation in an international context, and also I would contrast a bit a kind of old school approach of mass propaganda and brainwashing, and also a new approach. And I would argue that Hungary, in an interesting sense, provides case study for both. So the main questions I would like to deliver, and I'm not aiming to respond all of them exhaustively, but try to come up with some tentative responses. So how efficient institutional disinformation mass persuasion can be, what are the possibilities and what are the limits? Of course, this is a question, it's not my question, it's a question of more than a century of research on institutionalized persuasion. Second, how much institutional brainwashing today and yesterday is different than How much institutional brainwashing today is different than of yesterday and also that on tomorrow. Why the Hungarian informational autocracy has been so successful, and what do I mean by that? Viktor Orbán could govern for 16 years between 2010 and 2026 in an informational autocracy. What does it mean? I will try to explain. If you look at any of the governance indicators, Hungary was in a free fall when it comes to economic performance, the quality of institutions, and so on and so on. And using the power of persuasion and propaganda, he could very successfully maintain the power for 16 years. And why he lost control of the public agenda after 16 years. And I would come up with some tentative lessons for democracies in general, and then I would like to invite you to comment. And also because what I'm discussing here, I have wrote a preliminary working paper for the Central European University-led Outlet project with the same title, Brainwashing of the People, by the People, with the People, paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech. It was not literally like that because it was not with but for the people, but I will explain what does it mean. Also, I have written some articles on the topic, but I would like to elaborate it. Maybe it's too ambitious to a book project, and I would like to really harvest your knowledge and expertise when in the second part of this meeting. So the starting point for me would be that if we take a look at the zeitgeist and analysis of where the words democracies are heading, it's rather gloomy picture. We know all the of the literature of the democratic recession by Larry Diamond and a lot of others, and also VDEM index and so on and so on, all indicating a global decline in the level of and in the number of democracies as well in the world. A few books that come to this rather gloomy picture, add to the gloomy picture, and these are books that I quite like. So Giuliano De Ampoli's The Hour of the Predator, it practically explains to you how these days the alliance and coalition of populist politicians and big tech companies who have one same experience, and this experience is that you have to destroy the establishment and you have to change the existing institutes so that you become relevant. So you have to kill the lawyers, as he says, metaphorically, so that this alliance is just eating up capitalism as we know it and eating up democracies as we know it. Sergei Guriev's and Daniel Treisman's Spin Dictators, it's a book I will explain in more details. It explains us how these days the main tool for autocrats is typically distortion of the information and less violent repression. Sergei Guriev has been a consultant of Dmitry Medvedev during his presidential term. So if someone knows from inside how an autocratic regime works, it's him. And also there is another book from Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, which just explains us how the lack of democratic self-restraint of elected politicians can eat up the institutions of democracy. And he uses many examples from the United States, even from the level of states, not only from the federal level, and not blaming only the Republicans for this trend. So this is how discourse is typically today discuss the issue of how this institutionalized brainwashing, propaganda, mass persuasion, and also the abuse of power can eat up democracies. What I'm going to talk about is, first of all, the mainstream traditional understanding of mass persuasion, then the deficiencies of this approach, then the rise and fall of informational autocracies in Hungary, and then some ideas on how to survive in the age of informational autocracies. And when I'm talking about the traditional understanding of mass manipulation persuasion, my argument is going to be, as a spoiler, that when we talk about how gullible people are and how easy is it to manipulate people, we typically still live with the distorted experiences of the 20th century. And many of our concepts and many of our symbols and our understanding roots back to the experiences with the totalitarian regimes. And then I would like to explain why is it problematic. So if we talk about propaganda and mass persuasion in the public discourse, if we just look right in the Google image search propaganda, we typically come up with posters from the Third Reich or from the Soviet Union or from Mussolini's fascist Italy. So typically the experiences we have is the classical literature of propaganda and the classical experiences with totalitarian regimes. If we took a look at the mass persuasion in the policy discussions, and of course it's full of literature that for a good reason has this security aspect, that disinformation is a problem that can be deadly dangerous for communities, that can be deadly dangerous for states, that can be deadly dangerous for institutions. But we can talk about cognitive warfare, foreign information, manipulation. We can talk about a lot of policy papers that all based on one presumption, and this presumption is typically that voters and the electorate, especially in democratic or semi-democratic regimes, can be very easily manipulated using new technological tools and using also institutionalized brainwashing tools. So in the policy discussions, we also typically have this understanding that propaganda can be almost omnipotent. If we take a look at, and of course I don't want to oversimplify the very diverse social science literature in the topic, that many of you are well aware of how diverse it is, but there is a line of argumentation as well in the social sciences that talks about brainwashing, dark persuasion, manufacturing consent, and so on, how industrial actors, actors with big money, actors with big power can just persuade people and put some kind, make an almost total uniformal attitudes and can make attitudes almost uniformal in certain societies. And this, again, this line of literature is frequently coming up with experiences either from propagandistic and authoritarian regimes or with ideas that with big money and with big power you can do the big persuasion, which is almost omnipotent. And if we take a look at for the roots of this approach, there is Harold Laswell's book that is often cited, Propaganda Technique in the World War, which is about the First World War, and we have the so-called magic bullet theory, or the hypodermic needle theory that I assume many of you have heard of. Ironically, this is a term that Laswell have never used in his book. So we falsely attribute him this concept because he just have not wrote about it. But what he wrote about is that based on the experiences of the First World War propaganda, and let's just think about how much more developed technology is today for propagandistic purposes. So it's a linear communication theory that presumes passive audience and no big individual difference between the recipients, and the recipients can be easily hit by the message, like the bullet hits us, and we don't wear any bulletproof vest in this sense. And also one interesting finding, and Harold Laswell really writes about that, is that in our modern societies we have so individualized settings that you are alone. alone if you want to fight with the propaganda message. So the propaganda message can hit you and no one else is going to defend you. And he writes about it as again a possibility for, how to say, propagandists in a political context and also beyond. So just to summarize 4 presumptions of this traditional approach, and I would say that this traditional approach is the approach we typically have in the public discourse and even a bit beyond. So brainwashing is omnipotent, propaganda message works as a bullet, and propagandists have a machine gun. Second, propaganda is typically authoritarian in its tools, approach, and styles. So when we talk about propaganda and brainwashing, we typically think about the authoritarian and even more the totalitarian regimes. Third, propaganda is eternal and continuous. What worked in the past works now, and also what and propaganda today is similar to propaganda yesterday. And fourth, and maybe this is the most important one from a social psychological perspective, success is supply driven and not demand driven. So if you have more money, if you have more power, if you have more surfaces, then your persuasive power will be just bigger. So it's all about quantity. So if you just have more resources, you can get more persuasion. And this is rather a mechanical process. And if we like in Mechanic Orange or in Clockwork Orange as well in the film. So if we think about the anthropology of the classical approach of brainwashing, so we are conditioned with stimuli, and we are becoming puppets of the propagandists, and then we are heading in lockstep toward the same goals, typically malevolent goals that actors with big money, with big power want to impose of us. So what's the problem of this approach? So I would argue that mass persuasion has never been omnipotent, that it is not only authoritarian, that it is not timeless. So propaganda today is very different than propaganda yesterday. And if we are a bit bound by our understanding that is rooted in the experience of the 20th century. And last but not least, it's not only supply driven, the audience, the demands of the audience, the identities of the audience, and the needs of the audience do matter. So if you want to persuade people, then you have to talk to their identities and to their hearts as well. So first about the limits of totalitarian propaganda. And I'm not a historian myself, so I won't go into a lot of details, but I had good discussions with my historian friends who enlightened me in the topic. So if we just think about, for example, the very symbolic pictures of hanging of Mussolini and Clara Petrach, and the crowd that desecrated them in a square of Milan, then I think it was in itself a symbolic attempt that expressed quite convincingly that there are limits of totalitarian mass persuasion. Also, there is a lot of literature. And of course, all this literature have its deficiencies when it comes to, of course, data collection, and it has some speculative elements. You just could not make good research in totalitarian regimes. But there are historians who argue that Hitler's speeches, for example, had rather negligible impacts on attitudes, that vulgar anti-Semitic propaganda often failed, even in the Third Reich. The Eternal Jew movie, for example, was a movie that was highly unpopular in the Third Reich, and then it was made practically compulsory and also free by the leaders of the regime, so that more citizens will see this masterpiece and to persuade them, because there was not an organic demand for that movie. The effects of radio propaganda varied by prior anti-Semitic attitudes, according to some research, again, on the effects of Nazi radio propaganda. What does it mean? If you were already anti-Semite, it resonated you. If you're not a bloody anti-Semite, you could just switch off the radio and not really listen to it. So in short, and I don't want to go into details about that because it would demand more than a lecture, maybe when we talk about discuss the totalitarian propaganda, and often we still have this interpretation that in the totalitarian states you had a totalitarian propaganda that could totally persuade the public. Maybe what could persuade them even more is that they all face the barrel of the gun, the citizens, that if they did not behave, then it had its tragic or even legal consequences. So in totalitarian regimes, it's just you cannot really attribute the conformity of behavior to the conformity of views, because behind the conformity of behavior you have quite a lot of repressive tools that might play a more important role. And just to underline this argument, there is a whole book written on this subject, Not Born Yesterday, by Hugo Mercier, a brilliant French researcher who is working in Paris at the moment, if I know it well. So his idea, and the idea of his book is altogether that we have this conviction that voters and the citizens can be persuaded omnipotently, and they don't have their agency. And it's like they can be deceived, and they are ultimately gullible. And he challenges this idea, and he, for example, cites a Nazi intelligence note from the Third Reich, which said, writing it to the leaders of the secret services by one serviceman of an intelligence agency, is that our propaganda encounters rejection everywhere among the population because it is regarded as wrong and lying. And it is a note, if I recall it well, from 39 or something, so not even it was before the Second World War. So even in Nazi Germany, where we typically say that yes, Goebbels was the mastermind of propaganda, and no one was more successful than him, maybe propaganda was much less successful than we assume. Of course, today we have much more sophisticated tools of changing attitudes than they were present in the time of the totalitarian regimes at the first part of the 20th century. They back then had mostly radio, newspapers, billboards, and pretty much this is it. Okay, you had movies, but not the AI supported surveillance, public opinion polling, and persuasive tools you have today. But still, even today, I think making this making persuasion totally successful is a bit of impossible that I will elaborate on a bit later. So my second point would be debunking this traditional approach. Propaganda has never been timeless and eternal. Today's persuasion is typically much more about confusing the audience, while the 20th century propaganda was about sending one single message, for example, about global Jewish conspiracy as in the Third Reich. And the propaganda today in a different media environment typically builds on the presumption that you can't have a total control of the public domain like you could much more in a totalitarian regime. Even there it was not total, but you just can't censor everything on the internet. Not even China is able, that is doing its best or trying its best to create a totally censored media environment. So if you want to still control the spin, you have to confuse the audience to an extent that finally they are lost in the jungle of narratives, and the only thing that they want for is some points of stability and stable points of references, which is typically the strong leader. This is a kind of strategy that is very elaborated by great researchers when it comes to the disinformation strategy of the Russian Federation, but also it works in China. There are some articles that claim there is a similar logic in Turkey as well. So authoritarian propaganda today is typically different in its philosophy as well than yesterday, and it's not totalitarian in that sense. In its philosophy, it's more as Peter Pomerantsev coins it. It's a kind of post-truth dictatorship. So when you have so many postmodern dictatorship. So you have so many interpretations that you can just project a word when you say that every political statement is a kind of interpretation. Of course, yours is also an interpretation, but if no one else is better than you, then you as an autocrat have already won the game. And of course, it's not only politicians who abuse this logic. There are good works on how it is exploited, for example, by the fossil fuel industry, where the typical strategy today and in the last decades has been much more not to persuade the audience that the global warming does not exist and that fossil fuels are not harmful at all. It's just like to try to create a debate. So it's like there are some research which says that, but there are some others that challenging it. So if you can create a debate around scientifically established facts, and the same goes on with, of course, with the anti-vaccination movement as well. So if you can say that, okay, we just don't have any clarified and crystallized truth because it's somehow in the debate, and of course we as members of the academic community tend to assume that we can have endless debates about issues, but that, on the other hand, of course we know that if something is supported by 99.99999% of the research, then it's most probably something that is close to a scientific fact. But this exploiting this logic of Anglo-Saxon debate culture, you can bring it into science as well, and this way you can make people more uncertain about how harmful for the environment fossil fuels is, how dangerous for your health smoking cigarette is, and the list goes on, how unhealthy sugar is. So this is something that has been abused and exploited by private actors and big companies big time. So my third point would be state persuasion. State-sponsored disinformation is not only autocratic these days. There has been a quite of concerning research by the Computation Propaganda Project. It was a project of Oxford Institute and the Reuters Institute, and they wrote a paper back to 2019. They talked about computational propaganda that they defined as the use of algorithms, automation, and human curation to purposefully distribute misleading information over social media. And of course, there are multiple tools, bots, trolls, astroturfing, generative AI, and so on. And since 2019, of course, we had seen these tools exploding in their technological sophisticatedness as well. So the countries you see with dark blue on this graph are the countries where there are at least one political players who have some power in official institutions, either executive power or legislative power, who use this computational propaganda to deceive their own audience. And we can see that the majority of the world's countries are indicated with dark blue, especially in the more developed part of the world. United States is indicated with dark blue. And if we zoom on Europe, maybe you don't see that, but many countries, including Italy, including Germany, including France, and of course, including Hungary, for example, in Western Europe are indicated with dark blue. So in most of the countries in the world, and so the majority of the population on the earth lives in countries where their elected leaders try to mislead them, institutionally, systemically on social media. And only between 2017 and 2019, according to this research team, there was a huge explosion, 150% in countries using organized social media manipulation campaigns over this period. So the number of countries practically tripled only in that period. We don't have the new data on that, but I assume it could be even higher than that. And it brings me to my next point. So yes, spin dictate, yes. So propaganda and state-sponsored disinformation is not limited to democracies these days. To autocracies these days. And we live in an era of hybridization, which means that even the best functioning democracies can show some symptoms of de-democratization. And there are some, of course, many theories and terms that aim to describe this tendency. And what I find particularly appealing is spin dictatorship or informational autocracy. So this term describes a rather new kind of autocracy, or new kind of, I would say, non-democratic regime, where the most important rule of the game is not political repression, is not execution of political opponents, not imprisonment of political opponents, not killing journalists, not cracking down on protesters, but manipulating the information. And of course, there are exceptions to this rule. I think Turkey is an important exception, maybe. Russia these days is an important exception. But as Guriev and Treisman shows on a global database, even in classical autocracies, he argues that there are less political imprisonments, there are less political executions, and there is a lower level of violent expression than a few decades ago. And why? He argues that tools of information manipulation have become much more sophisticated, and if you are a wise autocrat, you don't have to use violence, because finally you can persuade your own electorate to vote for you. And even on free, but of course very unfair elections, you can win real elections without ballot stuffing and without depriving large chunks of the voters from the electorate. So if you are running an informational autocracy or spin dictatorship successfully, then you don't have to use violence, and also violence looks pretty bad on camera. So it looks bad on camera towards your own electorate, and it looks bad on camera internationally as well. So it's much easier to sell an informational autocracy internationally than a full-fledged violent autocracy. And what are the examples that they come up with? Singapore, Hungary, Peru, Turkey. I think Turkey has probably been a country like that after a while, but would be curious to hear some reflections on that. And Russia, as they argue, until 2022. And of course, I mean, they say that there are two kinds of autocracies: fear dictatorships, and this is okay. Maybe you will hear. Do you hear me this way as well? Okay. So this picture just tries to present the main idea. So the fear dictators, as they argue, they typically wore military uniforms, which had the message that if you can disagree with me, but it will have some consequences, and I have the military behind me. While they argue that dictators today are lookalike Democrats who are typically wearing suits, not military uniforms, and they just look alike dictators. And of course, as with every typology, it's imperfect, and you can say that there are, borderline cases. But I think this tendency of information autocratization is very well elaborated in their book, and I think it's supported by many arguments, and it stood remarkably well to Hungary. The most important features of information autocracies are fourfold. Low level of violent repression. I told it already. Second, mimicking and pretending democracy. And of course, we are living in an era of democracy. Even North Korea is called, the official name is Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, right? So it's also democratic. So there's almost everyone in the world pretends that they are democratic to a certain extent, but spin dictators typically try to just push the idea that violence plays no role whatsoever in maintaining my power. Third, they are less ideological, more pragmatic. So they contrast informational autocracies today to totalitarian regimes in the 20th century when, for example, the Third Reich, the Soviet Union, or the fascist Italy wanted to have some very solid ideological foundations and export these foundations. And they argue that spin dictatorships today, following on this democratic tradition or seemingly pseudo-democratic tradition, are less ideological and more pragmatic. And fourth, and maybe this is one of the most, this is an exciting point, and also something that talks to some research topic of Bram. Most important, the information autocracies are populist in the sense that they typically have less public support among the elites and the highly educated than among the masses and the less educated. And it's unlike democracies. So democracies are typically more supported by the elites than the underclass. The information autocracies have this reverse support, and it is something that we could very strikingly see in the case of Hungary, for example, that where in the least educated group and in the least wealthy group of the society, and according to, I mean, if you calculated on decimals, for example, Fidesz had 3-4 times as much support than among the most educated and among the better off. The irony here is, of course, it was a right-wing government that rather made redistribution so that the wealthy gets a bit more wealthy. So the middle class and the highly educated was much more the beneficiaries of the regime than the underclass, who was the losers by definition of the Orbán regime. Still, they supported his regime with much more higher likelihood. And of course, if we come up with examples such as the QAnon theory in the United States that, according to some polls, majority of the Republicans have embraced, and which I think it more resembles to a Z category Hollywood script than anything in reality, where you have the black state guys that want to exploit adrenochrome from the brain of the children, so and want to do this satanic and pedophilic rituals rather in secret. So this theory could also enjoy the majority of the support of the American population. And I think it's also a strong proof for that you don't need autocratic contexts so that you can have very powerful conspiracy theories and very powerful disinformation narratives spreading in broad groups of the society. And my fourth point in debunking the old school approach of persuasion would be that the recipient does matter, that there is a selective deceptivity. And there is a lot of literature on the cognitive drivers, the emotional drivers, and the motivational drivers of belief in disinformation. To summarize and oversimplify this literature, the typical finding is that you tend to believe the disinformation that for some reasons brings some benefits to you. So it either confirms your pre-existing beliefs or have some wishful ideas that you would like to believe in, or fits to the word for some purpose, or it just explains why you are worse off in the society than you would like to be. So you have to talk to the motivation of the electorate and also exploit the identities if you want to spread this information. So it's not true that it's only the quantity that matters. The content that does matter, and the content and the match between the content and the recipient's identity does matter. So I'm going, finally, after I think 40 minutes, I'm coming to the title and I'm explaining to you what the title is about. So I would argue that successful brainwashing is happening. Successful brainwashing of the people takes place in typically polarized settings these days, and it's also true for informational autocracies. Successful brainwashing takes place by the people, which means that typically you can create environments where the voters themselves are actors in distributing the disinformation and also spreading the disinformation, and it also happens with the people. So it talks to the identity of people, it exploits the identity people, and tribal myths can be used as information weapons, so voters can willingly and strategically spread disinformation, not just victims of deception. So this is what the classical model argues, that you are just a passive consumer of information without any agency, while in practice, typically if you are a good, very loyal member of your own political community, you will be the one as well who distributes this information. Maybe you know that this conspiracy theory, QAnon conspiracy theory, it's a bit of weird. Maybe not every component of that is true, but if it has an impact, and let's imagine how big impact the Pizzagate theory, a precursor of the QAnon theory, had in the 2016 election and helped Donald Trump in his election. So if this information weapon is a powerful weapon, why not to use it, regardless of an information is true or not? So but for that, you have to create good tribal myths. And it shouldn't be just one piece of disinformation that comes out of nowhere, but it has to talk to the identity of people. And I would argue, and I would not elaborate on that, also I'm not a real expert of this subject, and it's a huge topic, but it's there's an additional problem with the old school approach of propaganda that practically denies the free will of the people. So if you say that voters can be indefinitely persuaded and manipulated, then why does it make any sense to have democracies in the world? No, right? So if it's just if everyone is just algorithm, and if you understand the algorithm, then you can crack the algorithm as well, and you can control the people. As Harari argues, for example, he argues that political science tomorrow will make no sense because life sciences will be a good substitute. Because if you just understand what's happening on the level of the cells and on the neurons, then we just don't need these abstract ideas because we can just get down to that. But if you have this approach, then finally it's a strong argument against any democracy. So, and even if someone thinks that it's theoretically possible to have a total and perfect understanding of how the human psyche works, and you could do manipulation on an unlimited extent, I think practically it will always be impossible, because there will always be a variance of the decision making that gets out of control of human understanding and cognition. So I would argue that mass persuasion is not omnipotent, not only supply-driven, but it's more like motivated deception. You need the audience for that as well. You don't need an autocracy for successful mass persuasion. In fact, the most successful mass manipulation attempts, I think these days, are taking place in democracies, such as the United States, for example. And the new propaganda is modern as well. So information overflow and noise instead of information deprivation is the typical rule of the game. And I would like to briefly explain why Hungary is an important case for informational autocracies, and also what does the defeat of Viktor Orbán on the 2026 election tells us about the limits of informational autocratization. So if we just so I would argue that for 16 years, Viktor Orbán and his regime was built on the old school understanding of propaganda. You just have to occupy all the media, have unlimited of public funds, take over the messaging, centralize the messaging, push it through every TV channels, radio channels, on social media as well, through paid advertisement. Your message, it should be one message, not a single message, and you have to repeat it again and again and again until you repeat it until voters will believe it, and it worked remarkably well for 16 years. And despite all the problems that I mentioned with this model in describing reality. So if we take a look at the voting results in Hungary since 2010, we can see that Fidesz could always, the previous governmental party of Hungary with the leadership of Viktor Orbán could gain support over 40% in all the elections except the last one when they lost the election, and they could have this remarkably good voting results, which I think is in Western Europe is very atypical, right? To have a party, especially in proportional systems, including like in Belgium as well, to have a party over 40% support, it's very rare. Still in a mixed electoral system, they could have this very high support that was transformed due to the nature of the Hungarian election system to constitutional majorities. And they could do it despite the fact that, so this is on the graph on the left, you can see some governance indicators of the World Bank. And the line indicated with red is Hungary. So in Hungary, the governance indicators were in a decline, steady decline, and Hungary became the worst performing member of the region. And on the right, it's a graph that you can maybe see even worse, but the red line that ends at the bottom on the right down corner of the graph. So this is Hungary. So Hungary has been declining even in terms of transparency. So this is Hungary according to the Transparency International's ranking, and this is Hungary according to the World Bank's ranking. And I could cite many more rankings like that on the economy in particular, on healthcare and so on, where we could see that in terms of governance indicators, so how much the government delivers to the people, it was definitely not a success according to practically any kind of indicator. Still, Orbán could reproduce his power again and again on 4 consecutive elections. And how could he do that? He could there are a lot of experiences where we could see that he can manipulate the public opinion on topics and shape the public opinion in a rather autocratic manner, so not adjusting to the public opinion, but changing it, of course, building on existing stereotypes and prejudices. One issue was the migration issue. I mean, before refugees arrived to Hungary in 2014-15, migration was a non-topic in Hungary. No one was interested in that. Hungary is almost a homogeneous country ethnically, and it's not very diverse religion-wise as well. But when the migration crisis came, and Orbán could use this opportunity to shift the narrative from his governance problems to another topic, you could just see that there was an attempt. It's one of the leading websites of the pro-governmental media. Migráns means migrant. You could never use the word refugee, only migrants. And you can see that in every article. Even the bad weather is because of the migrants. The bad economic figures is because of the migrants. They are doing bad things. They are criminals. There are terror attacks and so on and so on. So it was all about migration. And as a result of that, by 2018, and 2018 was an election year, the relative majority of the Hungarians that had not really heard this idea beforehand, believe that Muslim leaders have a secret plan for conquering Europe and turn it into an Arabic continent. So it's the Eurabia conspiracy theory. It enjoyed 45% support among the whole electorate and a big support among opposition voters as well. And also the claim that Muslims want to stealthily force their culture on us. It was supported by 48%, again, a massive relative majority of the population. So, and it had become a winning narrative on the 2018 elections. Also, there's another narrative that have been built up about George Soros. So George Soros, back to 2010, when Orbán came to power, was a mostly unknown figure. I think everyone knows him. He's a Hungarian-American billionaire of a Jewish origin, and he was always very proud of being Hungarian, despite the fact that he had to flee Hungary in more turbulent times. Back to 2010, Viktor Orbán and George Soros still had some friendly meetings with themselves and between each other, and they had and George Soros had provided some philanthropic funds that Orbán was ready to accept, and there was quite of a bromance between them. Viktor Orbán was a recipient of a George Soros fellowship, and he went to Oxford with the help of this fellowship. And at that time, George Soros was a rather unknown figure in the Hungarian public, so less than 50% of the population knew who him is. But among the ones who knew him, he had rather a neutral, positive rating. In a plus 100, minus 100 scale, it was about plus 10 or plus 20. I mean, it was flip-flopping between them. But when in 2017, after the migration crisis, when there was a rather, fragmented opposition, and following the advice of American and Israeli campaign consultants, they wanted to come up, the Hungarian government wanted to come up with some kind of umbrella enemy that you can put all the journalists, all the think tankers, everyone under. It became George Soros. And there was a very intense, totally Orwellian campaign against George Soros. I mean, maybe the worst part of that was that when you could step on George Soros's face, when you went down to the underground, because there were some billboard places you could hire even on the floor. There were some Soros plans circulated, and it was a narrative that is created almost out of nowhere. So the government spent about 10 times as much to campaigns against George Soros than what George Soros spent to the overall philanthropic sector in Hungary. So there was quite a, an asymmetry, and George Soros, you can see him here as a puppet figure. He was also a puppet figure between Jean-Claude Juncker, the leader of the European Commission back then. It was the moment when European People's Party suspended the membership of Fidesz why? Because he was attacking a politician of a European People's Party. And it led to the exposure finally of Orbán from the European People's Party. But you can see that George Soros is a kind of axiomatic conspiratorial figure who is behind every evil things in the world. As a result of that, by 2018, 51% of Hungarians thought that George Soros wants to secretly bring refugees to Europe. And again, this view had become quite widespread even among opposition voters. So you had and on this scale of plus 100, minus 100, his popularity ratings were about minus 80. So, I mean, you had a neutral, positive figure, and you could turn him into a kind of metaphysical evil just using the power of mass persuasion. A third case study would be of COVID, and I will be just very quick on that. Hungary had the second highest mortality in proportion of the population because of the during COVID, and it was because of bad vaccination policies, it was because of bad lockdown policies, and because of governance failures. And unlike in Brazil, unlike in the United States, where Donald Trump was defeated in 2016, 2020, when Bolsonaro was defeated in 2022, and partially, according to political science literature as well, because of the voters felt that they were mismanaging the COVID crisis, Orban was re-elected in 2022 after having the second worst figures after Bulgaria in terms of COVID mortality. And how could he manage that? He was claiming, for example, he blamed coronavirus on Iranians. Let's exploit anti-migration sentiments. Iranians are the ones who brought this virus into the country. He could, and he blamed the opposition, and he blamed government critical intellectuals for being anti-vaccination. And in a country where anti-vaccination, it's at least good news because he was not anti-vaccination himself. He was blaming falsely the opposition and some critical figures with that. But he created this divide that he used in every campaign. There is the good side, pro-vaccination, there is the evil side, anti-vaccination, and he pulled the opposition on the other side. But not just the opposition, but also academics and political commentators, for example, who criticized the vaccine rollout of the government. And I know it from personal experience because for about a month I became the public enemy number one in Hungary for criticizing the government's vaccination policy, and in the conspiracy literature and conspiracy narratives of government, I created a plan that would have the opposition to come back to power through non-vaccination and through the death of many Hungarian people. It was a totally weird conspiracy theory. I made some legal cases against the origins of this narrative, but given that it was published like in about 1,000 article, 1,000, so of course it was like trying to putting off a forest fire with a water pistol. But I know how it works from personal experience as well. So as a result of this control narratives, the majority of the Hungarians thought that Hungary was progressing very well in COVID vaccinations, and about only 1/3 of the population was aware that approximately how much mortality and casualty COVID has had in Hungary. The 2/3 of the population systemically underestimated the number of deaths. Why? Because the government just deprived the voters of public information. For example, there was no regional distribution of the data, and what the state media typically published is only daily cases of infection and mortality without putting it into national or international context. In 2022, the government could win the election by pushing on an anti-Ukrainian narrative. I can elaborate maybe a bit more on that in the Q&A session. And it worked remarkably well. Why? Because it was right after that Russia launched an invasion against Ukraine, and there was a strong fear in the Hungarian population that it can have an impact on Hungary as well. What was ironic is that pro-Russian disinformation was the most successful in Hungary, a country that has no linguistic relationship to Russia whatsoever, no positive historical experiences with Hungary, to say the very least. So Hungary is a country that is proud of being the country of freedom fighters. Two of our freedom fights in 1956 and 1849 was broken down by the Russians. And Hungary has no religious ties to Russia either. Still, Russian disinformation could sell remarkably well. And also gender-based paranoia was one more instance when the government was successful. It was due to a referendum that they held at the same time of the 2022 elections. 1/3 of the voters in 2022 made their decision at the ballot boxes, thinking that if they vote for the left, to the opposition parties, then they are voting for a party that supports propagation of the gender-changing operation among underage children. And there was 0% truth into that. So there was no opposition statement of a politician that could be distorted in that manner. It was 100% fake. Still, it resulted in re-election of Viktor Orban. And I would quickly try to close my presentation by first of all, wondering a bit about why the Hungarian information autocracy failed in 2026. So what happened on the last election in 12th of April this year was TISA could gain 54% of the votes. The opposition party, Fidesz, could gain only 39%. It was against all odds. So the government had like 100 times as much resources that they could spend on advertisements, on campaigning. They had almost all the traditional media outlets. The opposition and the independent media was only online. The TISA did not even spent any money on public billboards, while if you went out to the streets, it was again Orwellian. So you were surrounded by the faces of Ursula von der Leyen, of Volodymyr Zelensky as the arch-enemies, and of Viktor Orbán as our savior. And still, it was a failure big time. What could be maybe some lessons that can have that can talk to other half democracies or ill-functioning democracies or hybrid regimes in the world as well. Of course, there was a need for a strong political alternative with a charismatic leader. There was also an important tool of TISA was preferring offline meetings and offline rallies compared to online ones. So they said that, okay, Péter Magyar was a rising star on Facebook, but he appeared in 3 or 4 times as much settlements in the country, doing a huge rally. It's a small country, a country of 10 million, so it's easier to do, but he was everywhere, while Orbán was doing much less direct campaigning. So he thought that personal connections, and of course, indirect personal connections are the ones that can help you to win elections. TISA had a kind of good populist approach, while Fidesz and the governmental side only talked about geopolitical stories and maybe the gloom and doom of Third World War, of how Ukraine would like to colonize the country, and also how Brussels will attack the country. The message of TISA and the opposition right now government in the country was that you can make a better country. So the emotional tone of the two campaigns was different. There was a very successful preemptive communication, which is pre-bunking in practice the best you can imagine in every stories that the government wanted to come up with. Of course, Péter Magyar himself was a regime insider beforehand, and he had his information that, okay, they want to do a smear campaign against you, for example, publishing an intimate video on you with your ex-girlfriend. And what he did in all of these times, he went on camera and said that they will come up with a story. And okay, I'm in this particular case, he said that, yes, I'm a young man, I have my sexual life, maybe there will be some videos published, half of it will be fake, other half will be maybe true, but don't get distracted. Finally, this video has not even been published, even if most probably it exists. He did the same with Russian disinformation. There will be some attempts of false flag operations. There will be probably some attempts to divert your attention and talk about the Ukrainian infiltration into Hungarian politics. Don't pay attention to that. So it was pre-bunking in practice, and it worked remarkably well. And also what I would also mention, I want Russian influence have become a political and politicized issue. And what I would like to underline as well, and it talks, I think, about some level of success of the European Union as well. EU secret services have revealed a lot of information about how Russia wants to interfere into Hungarian elections. Therefore, finally, Russia was unable to do that. But also there was an impact of the European Union regulation that was restricting political advertisements on social media surfaces. A response to that from Google and Meta was that there is no political advertisements allowed in the European Union anymore. It's not a perfect regulation. There are some advertisements can slip through, but the overall volume of advertisements in the Hungarian media space, social media space, was about the 100th of what it was at the 2024 election campaign when Hungary was a champion of these advertisements. So there's multiple factors that could maybe result to the collapse of this informational autocracy. Probably the most important one has been a pedophile case that has been broke out 2 years ago. The incumbent president gave a pardon to a helper of a convicted pedophile, and it had become a public issue 2 years ago, where the government that was always very proud of being family-friendly, being children-friendly, and so on, just could not really get rid of this claim that they were ignorant of the abuse of children, or they were abusing the children themselves. So a moral crisis of a moralizing government, it's probably was an important factor in the story. And lastly, last 2 slides are promised, and then I finish. So lesson 1 would be, what is the secret of successful brainwashing? As I told already, you can only brainwash people by the people and with the people, so talking to people's identity and also involving them in your political movement so that they will themselves be willing spreaders of the disinformation that you would like to spread. You should confuse through persuasion, information overflow, and bring your audience into information and learn helplessness, and should not really invest into a unidimensional propaganda message because it's rather old school. And also, what is probably the most important, this is where I think the Hungarian government have also lost in 2026, is that they did not read the public opinion. They would just wanted to shape the public opinion. So it was not a populist logic. It was an authoritarian logic. I tell you what you're interested in, and then you will be interested in that. But I don't not ask you that what do you want me to talk about. So you have to combine this authoritarian and the populist logic well in order to be successful. But of course, I don't want to be that cynical, because the most important lessons are mainly for democracies and maybe the ones that I mentioned. Of course, right now, we don't know in which direction Hungary will really evolve. We can have some hopes that it was a laboratory of post-truth and a laboratory of hybrid regimes, and de-democratization, it is going to be a laboratory of building back a democracy, hopefully, and it can be a post-truth regime. But there are a lot of question marks over the future, and of course, political scientists are never overly optimistic about the future. I would just come up with a few ideas on focusing on the demand side, on the receivers of information, what can work against disinformation and disinformation overload, according to our experimental and survey research. We had some research in which we found, and this is again, it comes back to this idea that if you want to fight disinformation and conspiracy theories, you have to be a good populist yourself as well. You have to do it by the people, and you have to do it with the people. You have to do it with the people in the sense that we have elaborated some populist interventions. Populist, of course, in quotation marks. We put the audience in a kind of expert role. What we did in one experimental setting is that we gave the participants of an experiment some points on instructions on how you can spot fake news and identify fake news and separate them from real news. But then what we told to them is that write an email or let's imagine that explain it to your family member on a family dinner, how they can spot this information. So you have to explain them. It's not me who teach you. It's you who have to teach others. So we empower the participants, and it worked remarkably well. So the ones who have participated in this condition had much better abilities to distinguish between fake news and real news afterwards than the members of the control group. We also try to exploit pro-social ties. So we, based on personal relationships and dominant moral foundations such as family values in Hungary. So coming back to the previous example, it worked the best if we told that you have to explain. And okay, we know that it's a bit of ageist. You have to explain to your grandpa or your grandma how they can identify this information. But you have to explain it to your family members. So it puts on you some personal responsibility as well. That if you want to be a good family member or a good friend, you have to explain it to them. We have tested also, we have done some classical inoculation experiments, and also a kind of democratic inoculation. And democratic inoculation experiment, we found that if we talk about how, and we did it before the Hungarian elections, but not knowing what the end result is going to be, what we found is that if we explained to the audience how cracks in an authoritarian regimes appear. For example, sometimes you can experience that some previous members of the elite come out in the public and tell that I'm not supporting this regime anymore. How the propaganda starts not to work, and so on and so on. So if we explained how the autocratic regimes can fall, instead of talking about how they are being built up, it could encourage the electorate and also make them more, receptive to transgressions of democratic norms. You can also use tactical ignorance, filtering disinformation. This is what Lewandowski and his colleagues recommend. So if you are in an environment full of disinformation, you sometimes have to close your eyes and close your ears. You don't have to be exposed to disinformation all the time, and it can be your personal decisions. And finally, maybe one important message from the Hungarian elections is there was a slogan of Péter Magyar. When he said, he used the hashtag, "Don't be afraid, ne féljetek." And the message was that don't be afraid to come out. Don't be afraid to criticize the regime. Don't be afraid to talk out against it, because the regime is finally more weak than you can imagine. And finally, the Fidesz regime collapsed in a totally unexpected pace. And this message of don't be afraid, so defeating pluralistic ignorance. Beforehand, everyone in the Hungarian society tended to think that, okay, maybe I have some critical views on the regime, but the majority of the society is totally brainwashed Fidesz voters. So I don't even have to try to persuade them because it's hopeless. And by, some kind of political voluntarism, the leader of the opposition in Hungary could get rid of that. And I think it just, amplifies the message we have and know from social science research that if you can overcome this pluralistic ignorance, it is the first and important step for any successful political change. And there are tons of articles that I wrote about that, but I won't explain to you. And thank you very much for your attention. Hungry for your feedbacks.
Thank you very much, Peter. We have some time, but not a lot, for some questions. So who wants to go first?
Hi, thank you. So my name is Orsolya Gulyás. I'm from the Brussels School of Governance, and I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much. I'm Hungarian myself, so this is very close to home. My question is really about your last point and trying to kind of tease out the more general implications of that. This "don't be afraid" messaging was really different from the demonization of Orbán that happened before, and the demonization of autocratic leaders. That is very often, we think, the way to get rid of them or to handle them. And can you elaborate a little bit, maybe what we can, as opposing them, learn from that, how to steer away from this demonizing attitude and taking the plurality seriously, that we are equal but not the same, but not from a stance of fear. If this is a clear question, I don't know.
Thanks a lot for the question. Here I have definitely have to repeat that I would like to avoid overgeneralizations. So I think you can think in the Russian Federation, for example, that, okay, the regime is weak and you can go out and protest and you can, and no, you can't, because it's much more repressive. The interesting case of Hungary, and I think this is that there was an ongoing debate about among political scientists that can this regime be defeated on elections or not. And I was luckily, and it was a good bet on the position that yes, it can be rather defeated, even if it's very difficult. But there were some political scientists that said, no, it's impossible. And here, I think, Péter Magyar and, many, political activists in Hungary as well were based on this conviction that you can, win elections even in a highly unfair environment. If the election will be too big to rig, to quote Donald Trump, then they just cannot fake it. And I do not want to be hyper-constructivist here, but I think it was a notion that finally proved to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. But for that, we really needed a hybrid regime that, as I said, did not invest into the military, into the police. So it was not a Belarus-like dictatorship where you had the armed forces who could have, let's say, force people into consent, but it was more an informational autocracy where the government wanted to paint itself much more scary than really is. And I think this is probably the most important tool that in foreign policy and in domestic policy as well, that strongmen want to do, is that to look stronger than you are in reality. And I think you're absolutely right that if you just demonize the autocrat, then you play into his. It's typically his. Is there any exception? I don't think so. You play into his hand, and on the other hand, if you start to paint them as a bit of ridiculous, as a bit of weak, as a bit of incompetent, and so on, you can possibly open doors, and then you can release some critical opinion from others. But again, for that you need a hybrid regime. If you do it in a much more oppressive regime, it can cost your life. So that's why I don't want to come up with some universal responses, because there is no such. But I think it also calls for the importance of political science as well. I mean, in political science, we have very sophisticated categories on describing the multiplicity of non-democratic regimes, and we need this sophistication. Sometimes for non-political scientists, it is just like totally, arbitrary and futile activity to go into these typologies. But in fact, these typologies, I think, can be rather helpful. And if you can describe well the political reality, then it can help you to win election. While if you go into this hopeless mentality, then it is going to be unsuccessful.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question on what this means for Hungarian democracy, right? And more specifically, I remember Orban himself describing Hungary or the Hungarian model as an illiberal form of democracy. And so I was wondering whether, is still standing that it was an illiberal democracy what Orban was trying to pursue till now, or as it seems to suggest, this was more closer to an autocracy. And I'm asking this because de facto democracy worked in this context. Orban was voted out of the office. So I wonder from a more, democratic theory perspective, what are we looking at here? And importantly, whether this idea of democracy at the head of the state trickled down to how people, Hungarian citizens, perceive democracy per se, such that we can also a bit understand what will happen in the future, at least trying to have a better idea of that. Even if humans are terrible at predicting the future, I'm going to try to still ask this question because I think it's interesting from a theoretical perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Brilliant question, and also something that is difficult to respond, because part of the political science literature found is that the more you think that the elections are going to be rigged, the higher likelihood is it that you go out and vote, which, I mean, honestly, to a certain sense, it sounds like it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, you go and participate on a ritual that you think is needless. But it's like, and it worked quite well for Donald Trump as well in 2024, right? Yeah. On the presidential elections, and it worked remarkably well for Péter as well. You say that, yeah, it's a regime that is unjust, that it's a regime that is undemocratic to a certain extent, but still the majority, if we are enough, then we can overcome all these difficulties. And it seemed to be, a message that resonated well with the public. And it and also how much it can be generalized. And how much the Hungarian regime can be described as democratic. I mean, it's a complicated question to oversimplify it a bit. I think Hungary can be well described as a hybrid regime, as I said, an informational autocracy or an electoral autocracy. Or I would even say that the term illiberal democracy is not as futile as it sounds for the first term. I mean, if we understand these regimes as regimes that want to do their best to make them get re-elected, also through non-democratic methods, but where elections still do matter, and where you can theoretically at least replace the government, then I think it's a maybe a better understanding. And here again, I think we are bounded by our pictures on autocracies in the 20th century. Yeah, it's like that. No way of winning any elections. It's like it's a Goebbelsian propaganda. It's like the state police of Hungary is everywhere. These were the typical sentences that you could hear on the streets as well, and it seems like an exaggeration. So that's why we have to have more sophisticated concepts, and in that sense, maybe this term hybrid regime, which is like the broader category of everything what we talk about, is describing a way of regime that can be theoretically defeated. But here again, we are of course bumping into the boundaries of our knowledge, because in some cases, the leaders of the hybrid regimes die before they could be re-elected. So was it a hybrid regime, or was it a more repressive regime that couldn't be defeated? So it's hard to tell. In the case of Hungary, we have this experience for a while. And I can tell you another one. It's Mečiar's Slovakia, where Mečiar was defeated on elections in 2000, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe 1998. But he built up a semi-autocratic regime. But then and there were which was more repressive than the Hungarian one. But still, he was voted out of power on elections before Slovakia joined the European Union. So it was not because of the EU constraints, but because it was, again, there was a too big majority to rig the elections.
All right, thank you. Very much like the presentation.
Thank you.
It definitely speaks to some of the literatures I'm dealing with as well, especially on authoritarian innovations, which makes it very interesting. I have two questions, but I'll just ask one in the interest of time. How do new technologies, AI and these types of things, how do they act as kind of a catalyst for increasing the impact of these types of informationally autocratic techniques? Do you expect that it will further explode, will become more impactful? So how do you estimate the impact of new technologies?
Yeah, great question. I think the conditions of a total control and total manipulation of voters is way more developed now than it was a few decades ago. And we right now have AI supported tools for the segmentation of the voters, for psychological profilings, for creating disinformation. There is a lot of research that shows that, and it was not with ChatGPT, but GPT-3. So if you wrote fake news with GPT-3, it was more persuasive for the audience than if humans wrote the fake news, because it was just more polished. You can also use AI tools for distributing of disinformation, bots, cyborgs, and so on and so on. But I would also argue that it's a bit of silver lining, not to go into this tech dystopia, that we also have very sophisticated tools for identifying and analyzing disinformation. And it's like, it makes a lot of sense, I think, in the societies that we live in, and it can be very efficiently used, to track, for example, anti-vaccination disinformation, but which typically, of course, coming from the fringes. But it has been used by, Ukrainian data scientists as well to stop the spread of certain disinformation narratives that were spreading in Russia-occupied Ukraine, and which was very harmful. So I think, of course, it's a game where the producers of disinformation maybe always will be one step ahead of the detectors of disinformation. But I would be a bit hopeful of some regulative attempts as well in the European Union, like the Digital Services Act and so on and so on. I can observe it closely from HDMO, and it's a very complicated picture, but it can bring about some positive change, like the restricting political advertisements. So in short, I think it's a huge danger. And again, if we take a look at the analysis on the 2024 elections in the United States, how Twitter and before the election also Facebook was much more exploited by the right for spreading narratives than by the left, and most probably the algorithms, not the neutral algorithms, but the algorithms that were, of course, tilted in a less neutral way or bended in a less neutral direction. So they played a very important role in that. So I think the technology is maybe out there to have some much more efficient brainwashing than ever before. But I would still argue that no political institution and no disinformation actor can be so perfect that they can do perfect persuasion. But I think this tech dystopia, some of them, I think, even if they sound exaggerating, but there are some truth into some of the claims. And for me, the most scary element is when the inventors of generative AI talks about the real dangers of generative AI. So I think it just talks about the importance of regulation and trying to keep it in somehow, under community control, which is the dominant direction in the European Union, which is against the dominant direction in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much. I was looking at the clock, so I just wanted to, I think we can perhaps end the discussion now. Of course, we can continue over the break, because afterwards at 6 we have another book launch of the Oxford Handbook on Belgian Politics. So thank you very much, Peter. It was very, very interesting and very fascinating. So let's continue perhaps the discussion outside with a drink.
Okay. Thank you very much.